Hello and welcome to another edition of the virtual book talk series sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture, or FIBAC. I'm Kevin Wisniewski. I'm the Director of Book History and Digital Initiatives at the American Antiquarian Society. And I am joined by my friend and AAS colleague, Amanda Kondik, who is backstage guarding the links and questions and related functions. Amanda just appeared in the chat function down below, which I will describe in just a moment. For newcomers, welcome. The American Antiquarian Society was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. Today, we are a research library and learning society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. Today's event features San Diego State professor Jessica Pressman, and it is part of a series of book talks dedicated to the history and future of the book. Each month, we will invite an author of a recently published monograph or digital equivalent to share that work and to answer a few questions from those in attendance. Now, before I get to today's guest, I wanted to give a quick overview of the platform we're using. We are currently using Zoom webinar. We're probably familiar with Zoom, but the webinar does highlight or does offer a few functions that I'd like to highlight today. First, if you look at the bottom of the menu bar, you will see a chat function. This is where Amanda and I will be sharing a number of important links, including those directing you to upcoming AAS virtual programs, and to the FIBAC mailing list, if you'd like to stay in touch. In addition, we'll also share links to Jessica's book on the Columbia University Press website, and we'll offer links to some of the citations Jessica will be using in her talk today. Second, you'll also see that there's a Q&A function. This is where you can submit questions directly to Jessica for the end of the talk. I would suggest that if questions arise during the talk today, that you submit those early instead of waiting until the very end. In addition, there is a feature in the Q&A button where you, the attendants or attendees, can vote up a particular question. So please read what other folks have posted before submitting. Finally, I'd like to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. For those who could not attend, or if you'd like to rewatch this talk, a video will be made available on the Society's YouTube channel. Finally, as well, if you like what you see here, I do encourage all of you to sign up for our mailing list. It's quick and it is free, and it is the best way to make sure that you don't miss out on any of our future programs. The link is currently available in the chat. And as you'll see, we have a lot going on and a lot coming up, and I'm absolutely delighted to share all of that with you. So thank you. Before I get to Jessica, I would like to thank her and the team at Columbia University Press for sharing an excerpt from Jessica's forthcoming title with those registered here today. As a reminder, Bookishness will be released in November, so mark your calendars. And with that, I would like to ask Jessica Pressman to join me here. There she is. Jessica Pressman is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University, where she co-founded the university's Digital Humanities Initiative. Today, Professor Pressman will present on her forthcoming title, Bookishness, Loving Books in a Digital Age, forthcoming with Columbia University Press in just a couple of months. She's also the author of Digital Modernism, Making It New in New Media from Oxford University Press, and co-author with Mark Marino and Jeremy Douglas of Reading Project, a collaborative analysis of William Poundstone's project for the tachistoscope, bottomless pit. I got that right? Tachistoscope, I love that. She's also co-editor of 2 volumes, Comparative Textual Media, Transforming the Humanities in the Post-Print Era, with Catherine Hales, and Book Presence in a Digital Age, with Keen Brillenberg-Worth and Carrie Driscoll. More information about Jessica's work can be found on her website, jessicapressman.com. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jessica Pressman.
Thank you so much. Is my sound okay?
It sounds perfect. Great.
Thank you. Well, I'm so honored and humbled to be talking to you all today as a guest of the American Antiquarian Society. As an interdisciplinary scholar, and one primarily focused on the contemporary period and primarily on digital texts, I feel a bit like an imposter for an organization dedicated to analog archives and the antiquarian. But I also feel strangely validated, like I made it. So I really want to thank you, Kevin, for including me in this incredible lineup. I've learned so much from the talks over the previous months. And I also want to thank all of you out there in the ether, even though I can't see you. I'm grateful that you're tuning in today. So today I want to give you an overview of my book's feeling and its purpose. I hope you'll read it eventually, and I do hope you'll pre-order it. So today I want to provide something a little different. I want to talk about the impetus behind the project, how it came to be, and what I hope it will do in the world. Bookishness, loving books in a digital age, is my love letter to my profession. To books and literature, certainly, but also to the generative and generous conversations that happen amongst scholars. This book was written as a series of talks that I was honored to give. So the book really is a testament to the spirit of collaborative minds willing to read and think and then rethink together in footnotes and Q&A sessions, in the hallways of universities, in the margins of drafts, and now, more than ever, in chat rooms and Zoom sessions. In an age of alternative facts, information overload, quick and polarizing judgments, constant crisis and absolute distrust, I feel deeply grateful to participate in a profession and live a life dedicated to human inquiry and to the humanities. As humanities scholars, we believe in deep historical and careful thinking. We pursue curiosity over uncharted territories and long durations. And this practice is supported, enabled, and often symbolized by the book. This book took me 10 years to write, in part because I didn't know what kind of book it was or how to write it. And in part because I left the profession for a little while. And in part because literary culture has changed so dramatically in the last 15 years that it was hard to know where to focus. This book examines many different types of objects, aesthetics, and cultural practices. But at its heart, it's a book about human attachment to books and to being bookish. Bookishness is grounded in the belief that books matter. And this mattering, this love of the material object and the supplemental meanings that it expresses, this is deeply indebted to and indeed dependent upon digital technologies and culture. So I'd like to read from the very beginning of the book. I know that my publisher kindly, generously distributed a part of the introduction, but just in case you didn't have a chance to read it, I'd like to read the text that I crafted to explain and define bookishness. Okay, now I'll show you some great slides, so here we go. Bookishness is a 21st century phenomenon, and it is omnipresent. Once you recognize it, you see it everywhere. In the 21st century, we no longer need books, physical codexes as reading devices. We have other means of reading, writing, communicating, and archiving. But that doesn't mean that some of us don't want books, and that want manifests everywhere. Indeed, at the moment of the book's foretold obsolescence due to digital technologies around the turn of the millennium, we saw something surprising: the emergence of a creative movement invested in exploring and demonstrating love for the book as symbol, art form, and artifact. This is what I describe as bookishness. Creative acts that engage the physicality of the book within a digital culture in modes that might be sentimental, fetishistic, and radical. Cell phone covers crafted to look like old books, decorative pillows printed with beloved book covers, earrings, rings, and necklaces comprised of miniature codexes, store windows that use books as props, altered book sculptures exhibited in prestigious museums, and book-bound novels that revolve around a book as a central character. Although the bookishness that I chart in this book is primarily Anglophone, bookishness happens across countries, languages, media, and genres. The obsession with the materiality of books spans the spectrum from high art to absolute kitsch. And it signifies a culture grappling with its own increasing digitization. The book has historically symbolized privacy, leisure, individualism, knowledge, and power. And this means that the book has been an emblem for the very experiences that must be renegotiated in a digital era: proximity, interiority, authenticity. So, what happens when books get digitized and bookish culture goes digital? When the word book may or may not refer to a material object. Bookishness signals a culture in transition, but also provides a solution to a dilemma of the contemporary literary age: how to maintain a commitment to the nearness, attachment, and affiliation that the book traditionally represented, now that the use value of the book has so radically altered. Books aren't going anywhere, but they are being repurposed and reimagined. Our relationship to books are changing, and often the results are surprisingly poetic and generative. So that's the beginning. My book started with a talk at a symposium at the University of Michigan called Bookishness. So yes, I stole the title. And it was organized by the incomparable Jonathan Friedman, for whose guidance I'm grateful every single day. I spoke at that conference about British author Stephen Hall's experimental novel, The Rorschach Texts, from 2007. And I argued that the novel's pages exhibited an aesthetic of bookishness, a recognition and response to the perceived threat that the digital would kill the book. Now, this was 2009. The Kindle had just emerged and taken over market share, and feelings about the death of the book were real and raw. Indeed, one of the remarkable things about Jonathan's conference was that it was not just academics in the audience. There were members of the local community. And I remember a bookstore owner passionately asking us panelists how we were going to fight off the death of the book. And my response to the question was instinctive and perhaps a bit glib, because I believed that Hall's novel, and others like it, demonstrated how the threat of the digital could actually be good for literature, could inspire aesthetic innovation onto paper pages and through codexical shapes, could turn our attention to the book as a material object rather than just a medium for storytelling. I was excited by what I saw as a distinctly contemporary bookish response. And then I started to see this aesthetic response everywhere, in the pages of less experimental fiction and on the screens of digital literature, where books and pages need not venture. Back then, I was still focused on the avant-garde, but bookishness quickly exceeded that category, spilling over from books and literature to other objects and spaces. I was invited to speak at Yale Beinecke Library's History of the Book series, and in Q&A, Lanny Hammer asked me about the value of bookishness. Is it good or bad? Kitsch or art? Ironic or earnest? And I didn't have a good answer. And I've received variations of that question for years, and I've never had a good answer. And today I believe that such questions actually say more about us, about our desire to judge and make distinctions, than about the things themselves, or about the literary culture that they represent. Because the literary is just not that easy. It's slippery and ever-changing, especially now. When I teach, I always include this slide, a slide that distills Robert Darnton's argument from chapter 2 of The Case for Books, wherein he warns against nostalgia for a medial past that was stable and secure. He writes, quote, "Every age was an age of information, each in its own way. And that information has always been unstable," end quote. To demonstrate why it's so hard to understand our contemporary information age, he then brilliantly breaks down the history of knowledge production into 4 fundamental changes in information technology, which are right here since the beginning, since humans learned to speak. And as you can see from the slide, the uptake shortens dramatically. So humans had a lot more time to get used to manuscript books and then to printed books than they did to the internet. And in my lifetime, things really speed up. So for my students, who are mostly digital natives, I add this slide onto the timeline to focus on the pivotal changes since the invention of the internet. The extreme speed of uptake in recent information technologies makes it hard to know the difference between Web 1.0 and 2.0, or to understand contemporary media culture more generally, let alone to assess and analyze it, or make judgments about what is good and bad. Even so, Lanny's question about the value of bookishness remained an important milestone for my project, because it made me recognize that bookishness is not just about literature or aesthetics, or even medial change. It is also about the formation of values, identities, and communities. We use books to identify ourselves and to form connections to others. We always have. Online, we don't even have to have actual books to do this work of identity formation. And yet, the presence of the book pervades the digital. Book imagery and metaphors have long served to make digital platforms and practices familiar. I argue that bookishness enables digital culture. So what I first identified as an act of revolution, an aesthetic of bookishness, turned out to be a means of recalibration. Bookish folk like us have learned to write books through word processing software, to teach classes about books online, and to hold book talks virtually. And through all of this, we have also learned to hold tight to the image, idea, and aura of the book object. The discipline of book history teaches us to pay attention to the materiality of literature and literary culture. And I am indebted to scholars like Leah Price, Andrew Piper, Deirdre Lynch, and Matt Kirschenbaum, and others who have shown the great benefits of merging book history and literary studies. For a focus on media and materiality, not just meaning and value, is vital to understanding contemporary literary culture. So I want to take a quick look at a few examples of bookishness from my book to see how it operates across diverse objects in ways that foster this reattachment to books in a digital context. So first, bookwork. Garrett Stewart Wright describes this genre of recent sculpture as demediating the codex, stripping away from books their primary medial function as a thing to look through in order to read, and thereby turning the book into something to look at. Doug Beube and Brian Detmar are some of our foremost American book sculptors, and they became my friends while writing this project, and I think they might be out there, so hi guys, if you're there. And they taught me a lot about books and why we love them. They each use books as their media for creating sculpture, and they understand their work as speaking to and from a distinctly digital moment. So Detmer states, quote, "My work is about reading books in new ways and about teaching us to think differently about the media we use," end quote. Certainly, this is book archiving of a different sort, shellacking and embalming. This art saved discarded objects, and Detmer often talks about how he originally used discarded encyclopedias and dictionaries that were no longer used. This kind of bookish art illuminates and showcases the beauty of the book as object, thing, and medium for sculpture and conceptual art. Just so beautiful. Bookbound literature also participates in the Bookishness project of promoting renewed appreciation for books. In my book, I explore many different examples of literature, from children's books to augmented reality bookish games, all of which share an interest in turning our attention to how books operate and why they continue to matter. Today, I want to consider a special little book, Leanne Shapton's Important Artifacts and Personal Property from the collection of Lenore Doolin and Harold Morris, including books, street fashion, and jewelry from 2009. This is a unique little book. It's a graphic novella that tells the story of a budding to broken relationship through two young writers living in New York City. And it does so through the visual arrangement and documentation of inanimate objects. Things left over from a romantic relationship. And all of this is presented in the form of an auction catalog. So you, the reader, are positioned as a potential buyer in a fictional auction. And reading here is an act of carefully considering the images and their captions in order to create a narrative context for the objects on the page. Shapton's book presents itself as a souvenir of an auction and also of a time before digitization, when human relationships happened through physical objects like handwritten notes in a book, rather than through text messages. And Shapton's book archives this past, and in a nostalgic, effective register, reminds us of the power of the book as archival object. The souvenir is, of course, a particular type of object. Susan Stewart writes that the souvenir, quote, is not an object arising out of need or use value. It is an object arising out of the necessarily insatiable demands of nostalgia, end quote. An object becomes a souvenir when it shifts from being a thing or commodity to becoming an object for projected desires of a lost past. Like a souvenir that acquires personal meanings only after one returns home from traveling and only after the immediate memories have dissipated, the book acquires new value, becoming a newly important artifact, to use Shapton's title, in a digital age, when its use value as a reading machine has shifted. Shapton's Important Artifacts is a beautiful little book that is a powerful souvenir to the shifting use value of books in our time. One more example, if you will. The trending genre of short stop-motion films that use the internet as a distribution platform for making books come to life. Stop motion is one of the oldest techniques for producing movies. An object is photographed in a series of still shots that, when sped up and run through the projector, depicts the object moving independently, as if alive. This vintage cinematic technique is popular once again, fostering nostalgia for the analog and the handmade, and stop motion movies about books are especially popular online. I read these stop motion shorts as enacting the idea of fetish, turning the sacred object of the inanimate book into a seemingly enlivened, animate actor. The distribution and circulation of these films, hosted at sites like YouTube and shared via blogs, tweets, hyperlinks, speaks to how bookish culture is transmitted. In my third chapter, titled Thing, I examine these stop motion fetish films in connection to a much older literary genre, the it narrative. In 18th and 19th century Britain, it narratives proliferated that positioned a thing, an it, as the central character or protagonist. Leah Price describes it narratives of the 19th century as, quote, taking on a narrower topic, how one very particular kind of consumer good, books, should be bought, sold, borrowed, and disposed of, end quote. I place stop motion bookish films in relation to older it narratives, not because of the same thing, of course, but in order to make connections between past and present, in particular, between cultures experiencing revolutions in industrial and information technologies that change human attachment to books. So, what do we learn about books as objects, media, and cultural symbols when we juxtapose and compare these very different bookish things? You can read my interpretations in my book, of course, and I hope you do, but I would like to maintain that the answers are less important than the questions and awareness that they raise. Questions about books, sure, but also about how we practice, teach, and understand the literary. In literary studies, we tend to close read individual objects or formal aesthetics. But a study of bookishness pushed me outside this disciplinary comfort zone. Accumulation, curation, and comparison were my main methodologies. Instead of case studies, I explored constellations and networks. I created my own archive, taking screenshots from Facebook advertisements, and then taking them seriously as part of literary culture. I can now see that I practiced the method of comparative textual media that my mentor, Kate Hales, and I explored in our edited collection by the same name. This book claims that literary studies is media studies, and that literary scholars need to recognize and realign our work accordingly. Now, my work has always illuminated the medial aspects of the literary, mostly the distinctly digital aspects of literature and textuality. But with bookishness, I urge us to ask and take pleasure in the process of trying to answer what we mean by book and how that term matters to literary studies, past and present. The fact that we can now rent books on Kindle and access them by clicking hyperlinks should affect the way we understand what a book is and how we are attached to it. Indeed, many of the examples of bookishness that I use in my archive actually found me online through algorithms that stalked my movements on social media and through machine readers that anticipated my scholarly desires. And this fact is important and should prompt us to consider what constitutes an archive, how they're formed, and the implications of these new actualities in a digital context. It took me years to figure out how to arrange my book. And what I finally landed on was a series of chapters dedicated to looking at books from different angles. After the introduction, I explore the book as a metaphorical shelter from the digital storm, chapter 2. The book as a thing and material object, chapter 3. The book as a fake, as in the long history of fake books, but also the proliferation of books online where they have no actual real body, chapter 4. The book as a weapon, figuratively and literally, chapter 5. And the book as memorial, a structural archive and symbol of memory, chapter 6. Literary studies is no longer, if it ever was, just about stories and content, nor is it solely about form and content. As I repeatedly tell my students, we must consider form, content, and format. And format means all types of codexical and computational media, but it also includes the complicated, ever-changing networks of convergence culture and participatory culture through which these media operate. So in a recent special issue of the online journal Post 45 that my friend Arthi Vadi and I co-edited, we brought together a variety of scholars working to address the question of how Web 2.0 culture changes the literary and literary studies. New formats mean changes in who writes, through which types of writing spaces, programs, and devices, and also who or what types of machines read this writing. In other words, the literary, like everything else, is transforming, and we need to recognize this fact in order to be able to begin to understand, let alone to study, explain, analyze, and then judge. I want to conclude by acknowledging that my book on loving books enters the world in a time when there are much greater cultural issues than understanding why or how we still care for the codex. Global pandemic, white supremacy, pain and crisis rule our everyday lives. 2020 feels like 20 years in and of itself. In my first chapter, I explain and defend why bookishness only examines the last 20 years of literary culture. This is a short historical time frame for a scholarly study, but the last 20 years covers a lot of medial change. Google taking off in 2000, Wikipedia 2001, Web 2.0 2004, social media platforms like Facebook 2004, Twitter 2006, Instagram 2010, Google Books 2005, Kindle 2007. The change is swift and unrelenting. In the maelstrom of constant crisis, revolutionary change, information overload, loving books can constitute an act of defiance and revolt, a declaration of belief in knowledge, history, beauty, and the human record. I take the imagery of Maelstrom from Marshall McLuhan, who took it from Edgar Allan Poe. McLuhan writes in 1969, quote, "It's inevitable that the whirlpool of electronic information movement will toss us all about like corks on a stormy sea. But if we keep our cool during the descent into the maelstrom, studying the process as it happens to us and what we can do about it, we can come through," end quote. I believe that we must keep our cool and study the process as it happens. Sustained focus and scholarly curiosity just might be the strongest oars to get us through these troubling times. It is in this spirit that I offer up my book on the importance of attachment and on studying those attachments in our distressed digital age. I hope it helps. Thank you for your generous attention and shared sense of humanness. I'm very grateful.
Great. Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that are posted, and I will ask those who have questions for Jessica to post them there now. I do have a couple of questions I'd like to start off with.
Sure.
At the very beginning of the talk, you actually mentioned that this was a 10-year project for you. A lot of changes, both in the profession, personally, and in the world itself. Could you just describe a little bit that in researching the book, in mapping out this survey of the last 20 years, what was the biggest surprise for you in your findings? And as a bit of advice for those who are actually working on their own projects right now, how did you kind of find your way in this journey?
Well, I mean it. I mean, the reason I structured the talk as I did is it really was about working with other people. It was about humans, like human attachments, and the feedback and emails I get from people sharing other objects and making connections and pushing me to think about these questions differently. The book changed a lot. But I think what was surprising is that, is actually what is most, stable in scholarship, is that you think you have something new, you have a great idea. That I thought, like, the bookishness, this new aesthetic of bookishness is totally new. It's about the digital. And then when you start researching, you realize, no, of course, there's much longer genealogies. And in fact, I was fascinated with and planned to have an entire chapter on the death of the book genre. Like there's a whole rhetoric about the death of the book, which I trace and kind of close read at the turn of millennium, but repeats itself over centuries. Both the death of the book and also the death of the death that the book would murder other things, like this will kill that, Victor Hugo. But also in the 16th century, all this concern that the rise of printed books would destroy our ability to know what was good to read, right? So that kind of continued concern that swirls around and gets embodied and represented by the book. That was really surprising and fascinating to me. Advice for other people. I hope this is a book. I mean, one of the reasons it took so long, as I said, is because I really wasn't sure how to frame it and how to take all of this archive and ideas and make it linear and put it, frankly, in a book form. It's much more of a hypertext, if you will. And so I hope that it opens up new avenues for thinking rather than shutting them down. I hope that it inspires people to think about connections between books and digital, kitsch and high art, and to think about all of the various spaces that the literary is actually happening and blossoming today.
On a similar note, and I think your subtitle, the subtitle of the book, notes, I think, what the core of the book is really about. It's about our love for bookish things, for things that, whether they're books themselves or things that are just simply associated with books. I love the opening paragraph in particular, because I think there's a line at the very beginning. It might be one of the opening sentences that says, in the 21st century, we no longer need books. And I'm waiting for the gasp, right? And simultaneously, the entire book is about how we need books in our lives, that they are, whether it's the physical object or just the associations and relationships and infrastructures that either guide books or historically have guided books or created books, whether it's about institutional formation or personal identity formation or the like. I'm really interested in this idea of bookishness itself. So if you could maybe just take a moment to like unpack it even further and to kind of, you know, unweave kind of the paradoxical elements of the obsolescence of books and then the absolute need and desires and fetishness we have for books.
Kevin, you're gonna have to get the book. I mean,
I know.
The whole book's about it is
Pre-order.
No. I mean, I think paradox is exactly the right word. It is a paradox, and it's a productive and poetic paradox, and that's why it started really as an aesthetic. Like I started to just see this kind of strategy and these tropes and kind of metaphors everywhere, and so it wasn't so easy. That's why I deeply remember the gasp, and there was a gasp when I started giving the versions of these talks, 10 years ago, when I said we no longer need books. And there was a gasp in the audience, like, who are you? How could you say this? You're supposed to be an English professor. So there is a paradox there. And I think that it's a productive and poetic one. And I think like the Bookwork Sculpture, I hope all of them are good examples, but I hope the Bookwork Sculpture in particular, some people, when they see these sculptures or images of it, they think like that's sacrilegious. That's a desecration of the sacred object of the book. How could you carve into it? How could you take, Brian like takes a scalpel and carves into it, and Doug just plays with them in fantastic ways. But another way of looking at it is that these are sculptures that save and reframe and produce a renaissance of book appreciation and interest and love. So certainly there's a paradox there, and I think that's actually what's exciting to me. To avoid your question completely, so you have to go read the book.
One more question, that I do want to turn it over to our audience here. One of the things that really excites me about the book and about what you're talking about and looking into is that resurgence of kind of creative pursuits, the remaking of the book, all of these like DIY projects that are happening all around us, both resulting in like digital forms, but also other print and material forms. On the other level, bookishness is, and these various pursuits are actually in part, arguably, driven by the fear of the death of books. Mm-hmm. You make a note throughout chapter 1 in particular about how digital forms and digital modes challenge the status quo, how they threatened power dynamics.
Yeah.
And whether that's literary values or publishing practices or academic institutions or publishing institutions or the like, part of what I see happening though is that whether you're talking about Amazon or Google or a lot of these other venues, a lot of it, or even the mask that we're looking at now, a lot of these items that you're seeing at your local gift shop, that you're seeing on various online platforms, that you actually saw in the book at an airport at one point. These are products. These are items that are sold. So I'm wondering in part how much of this is actually driven by the market, as it often or almost always is. And in that case, what's changed? What's new about bookishness in the last 20 years that we haven't seen in the decades prior?
I think that's a great question, and I actually think that that's part of the paradox of new and old too, right? I mean, great work in book history has shown us that the market has pushed books. Jane Austen selling soap, as Jane Barkas, great work on Sense and Sensibility and soap selling, and also in the 20th century, Freud's nephew, I think it's his nephew, did a marketing campaign to put bookshelves in middle-class American homes as an in order to sell books. Like booksellers hired him to do that advertising campaign in the 40s and 50s. So these have never been separate things, right? But we do have a different kind of capitalist culture. We have convergence culture, Henry Jenkins. We have Amazon is a corporation, is a website, is a technology, is an infrastructure, is a distribution network, and a bookseller, right? And all of and a review culture, and all of those things matter to our interactions with and ideas about the book. So some of these things are new in this digital, I would say, the convergence culture part of it. But some of these thinking about books in relation to commodities in relation to the marketplace are not new at all. And that's why I brought in the quote from Leah Price's fantastic book about how to do things with books in Victorian England, wherein like the entire book is about how Victorians did things with books other than read them. So I think there's a lot. I think this really is where book history comes in to explain to us how to unpack our contemporary age and how to recognize that you receive a book from Amazon, but Amazon is imprinted all over that attachment to the codex and to the literary.
Yeah, you have a great passage in the book too, where you actually talk about how we read the arrival of those packages as well.
Yeah, and I think our attachment also, I talk in the book later on, it's not all positive, right? Especially for us scholars and teachers. Like this bookshelf behind me is both wonderful and beautiful, but it also represents a lot of books I was hoping to read and haven't read, and hope I find the time to read. And so they're objects of attachment, and that attachment isn't always positive, but they do inform us.
Great, thank you. I am going to actually stop my questions for a moment and turn to the audience here. In the Q&A function, we have several, actually a lot of questions here.
Yeah,
I'm going to get to as many as we can. Just looking at the first one here, what do you think bookishness means in the context of the pandemic, a time in which we've seen access to archives and libraries restricted, the rise of Amazon, which started as an online bookstore, among other things, and the move to remote learning?
That's a great question, a very full question. And of course, I turned in my book right before pandemic, but then I did write a little piece for Avidly, the channel of Los Angeles Book Review, because during pandemic, I was reading Victorian literature in preparation to teach it, and found in Wuthering Heights so much bookishness, like just found in the pages of Bronte's novel, books mattering not as things to read into, but as physical material objects. So I wrote a little piece for Avidly about why books really matter as physical objects and kind of attachments to a longer history of human connection in quarantine. But I think the question of access is really interesting too. There's a lot of constraint, but also a lot of museums and archives have made themselves open to people in new ways. So perhaps our thinking about archives is, and probably in the future will be informed by this experience. And informed by thinking that we can have digital access to special archives. So it's a really great question, and I think actually I think that quarantine and our kind of sheltering in place, and our kind of acute awareness to the things and people around us actually provides a better frame for understanding and questioning the thingness especially of books, and of books if we choose to surround ourselves with them and identify through them. So I'm actually hoping that this book means something more, or perhaps in a different, clearer register after this experience. I hope.
Yeah. I like the terminology too. Hopefully we'll have time at the end. The thingness of a book, and in chapter 1 you also have the there-ness of a book. So we might get back to that, but
Piper, I mean, his book, I think I'm hoping it's in these, that's a brilliant book that really informed mine, where, you know, he really reminds us that books have, the importance and value of books is that they've been there, that we can point to them or hand them down or touch them. And there's a kind of importance to their there-ness, which I think he takes from a line from Gertrude Stein. So I can't claim that one.
And that is actually in the chat as well right now. I do want to remind folks that if you're submitting questions to the chat, do try to retype those into the Q&A function. Our next question is in regards to if different periods or different books in different periods are more or less prone to being transformed into different kinds of objects than others. So, for example, are bookish wedding cakes, for instance, more likely to draw on something from Jane Austen, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's also interesting to me that I receive variations of same questions over like 10 years. A variation of this question is often, you know, why is it Jane Austen, and often children's literature and women's literature that are the subject of the cakes. And there's a few slides that I didn't include here, but the Jane Austen leggings, there's a Jane Austen duvet cover, there's a Jane Austen cake. And I think, you know, it's not Henry James or James Joyce. So I do think that there probably is, especially to the kitsch, and I see that I'm honored that Daniel Tiffany was here or is here, because his book on kitsch has totally informed mine, my understanding of that term and its importance in literary culture. So understanding that, you know, there are kind of values, the female and the child, but also the canonical can be more easily switched over to the kitsch element and the kind of corporate commodity element as well. But the kind of comfort and familial, and the also the paradox of both canonical book, but also not so serious. So I think it's a really good question. And that also goes, I see in some of the great questions in here, to the kind of pleasure and joy aspect of it. So I do think that there is a gendered component here, and probably we might even bring in CN Nye and the cute category. I have some of her work in here has inspired mine too, on thinking about the cultural values and politics and kind of gendered aspects of some of these marginal aesthetics and labels that we give to, like the cute cupcakes, for example. So I don't know if that answers, but I think that it's a very valuable question to ask: which elements get turned into the kitschy objects, and then of course, like which ones I select, which is that might have something to do with it too. But I have not seen a bunch of leggings with Henry James or James Joyce, whereas I have seen quite a few with Jane Austen.
We have a couple of questions next in queue here related to physicality. So the first is actually, to what extent do we see book as body? Thinking of augmentations, adaptations of books for non-able bodies, blind bodies, dyslexia, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the language of book and book history has always been about bodies, right? And books were made from bodies, animal bodies, at least the flesh of animal bodies. So, I mean, they're intertwined and they're absolutely part of that discourse. And I think that's what becomes really interesting, to me at least, when they go online. And that's why I bring in that language of fakery, which is not binary, it's not real or fake, but actually the kind of simulacra, and the reason why we would want embodied objects, and especially the embodied object of the body, the sacred body, in a digital sphere where, at least at the beginning of the web and of discourse of the digital, there was real fear of the disembodiment. So I think these, you know, again, to go back to that paradox, like it's all there. There's a reason why I focus on books rather than so many other nostalgic, fetishized objects like vinyl or typewriters or those things, because the book is and always has been associated with body. Even in, you know, Peter Stallybrass's writing about the inseparability of the Codex and Christianity, right? So it's a certain kind of sacred object that is sacred in its very bodiness and its thingness.
Nice. I'm moving on to the next question. I do want to get to as many as possible here. The next question is in regards to book as memorial. So the last chapter of the book, we're skipping to the end. Bookishness seems reactive to perceived threats or competitors to the codex as medium. Are there examples of bookishness as proactive and expansive, as opposed to protective of a lost past?
That's really interesting, because I'm not sure. Let me think of it as proactive or protective, because maybe I misunderstand the question, but I'm not sure that I see it as so simple as either or. The last chapter, and there is a little coda that comes after that's really about my daughter learning to read books and the feelings of that. But the final chapter on Memorial is on Jonathan Safran Foer's Tree of Codes. And I have a slide, I can find it, which is a die-cut artwork of Bruno Schulz's book from 1934. And so I'm arguing that the book is similar to our Bookwork Sculptures, is both, it's archiving as it destroys, it's protecting even as it rethinks. And so I'm trying to read this question. They're reactive perhaps, but in ways that I think take the substance of a perceived threat and as an opportunity to create, which I actually think is, is the muse. It's just part of literary history, right? Whether it's, Keats and the perceived threat that he'll lose the moment of inspiration, or the perceived threat that we have these, that this will kill that, but this new media will destroy the contemporary moment. So, I guess I'm not being articulate because I'm not sure how to answer that either or question. I think that they do both, and I think that's why I'm excited by this phenomenon, and especially by the fact that I see it across what we might traditionally call, or some people might still call, highbrow and lowbrow culture. That it just is and kind of everywhere. Maybe Kevin, you can redirect me.
Yeah, I know. I think you did a great job, and we can continue that conversation as the questions kind of develop here. I think it's an interesting question because it is so complicated, especially with the state of the world right now. And as we kind of further enter the digital age, we continue to ask those questions of how do we grieve, not just individually but also collectively.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, in that chapter on Memorial, I did a lot of work to go back to the question of the book as body, thinking about memorials to the Holocaust and to the people of the book. And a lot of the memorials to the Holocaust are grounded in the imagery of books, and absent books, and in the figuration of a lost people and their connection to the book. And so there's a lot there that is both, memorials represent loss, but also provide a space for refusing to forget. So there's presence and absence at the same time. And I think that bookishness does the same. And in so doing, in some ways, of course, informs, like any archive, inform how we will in the future understand books and understand this contemporary culture's understanding of books and our relationship to it.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is the following. Phenomenal talk, Professor Pressman. Your talk made me think of images of African-American men and women in the 19th century US holding a book, sometimes the Bible, but sometimes not. Charlotte Fortin Grimke had an image like this, and she is often described as a bibliophile. Can you elaborate on the link, if there is one, between bookishness and bibliophilia?
Absolutely. I mean, definitely, yes, there is a fantastic link. But I also think the other element of that question that's really interesting, and I don't think I got to in this talk, is the political aspect of the book, right? So we tend to think bibliophilia, we love books, books are great, but also books are symbols of power. They have been symbols of oppression. They have been the means through which entire peoples have been decimated, if not converted. So they are, you know, they're symbols of who is able to read, who is taught to be literate and thus valued as a human. And taking from, you know, Patricia Crane's great book history work on children's primers in early America, children learn to read themselves into books and to understand themselves in relation to books because children's primers presented letters as bodies, right? An O is a person crouched over as a, you know, their body becomes the shape of the letter, etc. So again, this connection to bodies, but also, like, as we know in your example of the image of an African American woman holding a book, it's not just loving books; it's about power and a certain kind of alignment of literacy with the ability to vote and have power and own a book and own your body and own yourself. So again, like, this is, the bodies of books are deeply important symbols.
Related, this question's a little further down, but I think it was somewhat related. In terms of bookishness and where we are in 2020, how does bookishness transform the way we collect books?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know if it's bookishness that does it, but I hope that my study of bookishness makes us ask these questions. But I do think we collect. I mean, I know we collect books really differently. Like, so many people use Kindles, right? So they aren't actually collecting or owning books. They're renting books. They're leasing books from Amazon, which should give us pause and question about what's our relationship to our perceived book, right? And then the books on the shelves, what do they become if you're not actually using them to read and consult? They become decoration of sort. So I think this is a really great question. And of course now, you know, I'm teaching at a time when we can't go to our university library. So this question of, you know, being amongst the books, or how you train junior scholars to do research without actually being able to move your finger across the line of books on a shelf in the library. We are experiencing this huge change. And when I was talking about the maelstrom of change taking from McLuhan, this was before quarantine started. So, I mean, I think, like, all of these questions, these are certainly the questions that we should be asking, because they will be, our experience right now, I think, is laying the groundwork for what literary culture and literary studies will be for a long time. So I hope that this book, bookishness doesn't answer that, but I hope it opens up those kinds of questions.
Great. I'm going to try to get to one or two more here. We're going to have to wrap things up. I apologize, but I do like to send all of these questions on to our guest speakers. So, you know, Jessica, you will have a copy of all of these questions just after the talk today.
Will I have emails I can respond?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay,
absolutely. Great. Yeah. And if you'd like, we actually sent we copied Jessica's page in the chat, so you could contact her directly as well. Please. One more question here. I appreciate how you decenter the book as object to focus on human experience. I'm curious about how you understand our physical engagement with digital and analog media, or what might be called an embodiment of bookishness.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think I'm deeply, I mean, I am a student of Catherine Hales's, and which is, you see, I hope if you know her work, you see it in my work everywhere. And I say that because her work allows us to understand that we've been shaped as literary scholars by ideologies of print and books that make it hard for us to take seriously the digital, but also that the digital is embodied, right? That there is the idea that the digital is disembodied is also an ideology, which she traces back to the Macy conferences and the emergence of posthuman, et cetera, in her How We Became Posthuman book. So the digital is very embodied. I mean, I was most worried in this talk about my internet connection and my lighting and would the slides work and all these physical things, right? Even to do this digital talk. So, and of course, how we interact with these machines, and if you look at the slides a little bit, like you'll see, or even the kind of the history of computers, that these laptops look like books. They open like codexes, right? And our laptop cases to look like books do all of that kind of simulacra embodiment as well. So I think that our understanding and our theories of embodiment and our understandings of the role of the body carry over into the digital and should give us purchase for analyzing it. That's why I'm always, I'm always working against any binary of digital versus print or embodiment versus disembodiment. And I hope that bookishness is, in its paradox, kind of synthesizes and demands us to consider those things as inseparable from the start. I hope that answers.
Yeah, and just as kind of a follow-up, in terms of actually teaching, you're a professor and you're teaching classes in both book history and in the digital humanities. Increasingly, we are or have, as a collective, to one extent or the other, moved to online learning and online teaching, and are now teaching, students who are no longer physically right in the same room anymore. I was wondering, as you kind of mentioned, your concern in part now is, does the technology work? Is the camera working? Is the light okay? Et cetera, et cetera. Is the internet working? Do you have any advice for friends and colleagues in regards to how we prepare, or how we shift, or how we continue to maybe best or most effectively teach online?
Well, I don't know about advice.
or what not to do.
Yeah, no, although I will give a little pitch for my colleague, Pam Lack, and I, from the Digital Humanities Initiative. We created a website, teachdh.sdsu.edu, which we shared this summer as a kind of collected best resources and practices from our colleagues, showcasing like the amazing colleagues at San Diego State that have lessons, including lessons in book history and critical thinking. So you can check that out. But I would say that in relation to my work, again, to bring in Kate Hales, like recognizing how we as literary scholars have been impacted by ideologies of print and book culture. And here I'm thinking of Bonnie Mack's book On the Pages Interface, for example. Once we start to see the book as a medium and technology, and once we start to see its inseparability from the internet and digital, then we can start to see connections rather than divisions and oppositions. And that's really important for our students, because I found, our students are digital natives and they read and write online and on computers most of the time, but they've been told that that doesn't count, that that's not literature and that's not real writing or thinking. And that's a huge disservice. I think that's just wrong. And I think it's incumbent upon us, as regardless of online teaching and learning, but especially now, to articulate those connections and to include the digital in our studies of the literary and of book history. So that would be my more of a polemic than advice, but I think that's really something that's important for us to consider.
We're just about out of time, or maybe actually running a moment over. So one last question. This is actually kind of buried in the stack here, but a good one to end on. Jessica, what do you see as the future of the book?
Oh, I see lots of futures for the book. I mean, as I said, the book's not going anywhere. And indeed, if anything, I hope that my book is an appreciation of books in a digital age, of all the things that they can do. And I mean, I've been inspired by so many book artists, book collectors, book scholars, and then, you know, just people posting things online. I mean, I hope that Bookishness is really a repository of avenue book perfume, friends. You can get perfume to smell like a book, but also, of course, great literature that cares about the book, that cares about literature, and I see futures rather than a future, and whether that future includes actual books or not. Our work is important, and this kind of conversation about a book that doesn't even yet have a physical body, and in a space where I'm talking to a screen rather than to 100 other actual bodies, I think our future is bright, and I'm really, really grateful for all of your attention and questions, and especially to you, Kevin, for inviting and moderating.
Oh, thank you very much. With that, I will say thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. I'd like to thank everybody that's here in attendance. Our next talk is scheduled for October 29th. It will feature Adam Gordon, who will discuss his recent book, Prophets, Publicists, and Parasites, Antebellum Print Culture and the Rise of the Critic. So join us then. Do remember to check out our future AAS programs and to sign up for our mailing list. So thank you again, Jessica.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And until next time, thanks to all of you, and be well.